Carson Hale only printed one wrong letter in the name of a female chief executive named Vivian Kingsley Wolfe on a $312 invoice. But in the middle of a crowded ballroom, she hurled the paper against his chest and announced that he owed her $1 million, or she would bury his little shop for good. Nobody in that room knew the quiet single father in the worn jacket was once the only certified reviewer trusted to sign off on her $88 million electric vehicle contract. And when Vivian pushed him past every limit of decency, a single signature withheld would bring her entire empire to a standstill. If you believe quiet integrity can outlast the loudest cruelty, stay until the very last line and see what patience is truly worth. The ballroom of the Ashford Grand sat on the 20th floor of a downtown Chicago tower, all glass and gold light, the kind of room where champagne cost more than most people made in a week. Vivian Kingsley Wolfe had rented the entire floor to unveil her company's newest line of electric vehicles, the centerpiece of a bid for the city of Ashford's transit contract, a deal worth $88 million. Investors in tailored suits drifted between high tables, murmuring about horsepower and battery range, while photographers adjusted their lenses toward the stage where her name would soon be projected in silver letters 12 feet tall. Carson Hale had been hired 3 days earlier through a rush order, the kind small print shops took because turning down work meant turning down rent. His shop, Hale Ledger and Print, sat 2 blocks off the highway in a strip mall that smelled of toner and old coffee, and he ran it alone since his wife passed, raising his young son on schedules built around school pickups and printer maintenance. He worked through the night assembling name placards, payment records, and the guest packets that would sit on every table, following the order file sent to him by an assistant named Marin Whitlock. The file Marin had rushed through in the chaos of preparation listed the chief executive's name as Vivian Kingsley, missing the final letter of her first name and dropping the hyphenated Wolfe entirely. Carson printed exactly what the file instructed him to print, because that was the job, and a print shop does not editorialize a client's own paperwork. He delivered the boxes himself that evening, dressed in a plain gray jacket among a sea of designer suits, carrying the invoice for $312 tucked inside a manila folder under his arm. The elevator ride up to the 20th floor felt like crossing into a different world entirely, the scent of expensive cologne and fresh flowers replacing the familiar smell of toner that clung to his own clothes most days. Carson had delivered orders to plenty of offices over the years, but rarely anything on this scale, and he moved through the growing crowd with the practiced invisibility of someone accustomed to being overlooked in rooms built for people wealthier than himself. Waitstaff carried trays of champagne past velvet ropes, and somewhere near the stage a technician tested the lighting rig that would soon illuminate a fleet of gleaming electric vehicles positioned like sculptures under the high glass ceiling. He set the boxes down carefully near the registration table exactly as instructed, checked the contents one final time against his own printed manifest, and turned to find Marin so he could confirm delivery and be on his way home before his son's bedtime. Vivian noticed the error the moment she lifted the guest folder from the welcome table, right as 2 investors leaned in to examine the specifications behind her. Her own name, misspelled, sat printed in bold black letters for anyone in the room to see. A quieter woman might have folded the paper and mentioned it privately, might have simply asked for a correction before the evening continued, but Vivian Kingsley Wolfe had built her entire public identity around the idea that nothing near her was ever allowed to be imperfect. She turned toward Carson with the practiced fury of someone who had learned early that anger, delivered loudly enough, was rarely questioned. The room quieted as heads turned, phones lowering, the orchestra of small conversations falling into a hush around the 2 of them. She held up the guest folder like evidence at a trial and said, loud enough for every table to hear, that a mistake this small to him was a crack worth $1 million to her. Vivian did not stop at humiliation, because humiliation alone had never satisfied her. She waved for her lead attorney, a sharp, unhurried man named Derek Ashcroft, who arrived at her side within minutes carrying a leather portfolio as though he had been waiting nearby the entire evening. Derek explained to the gathering crowd, in the calm tone of a man reading a grocery list, that a misprinted executive name on an official invoice could constitute damage to brand identity, investor confidence, and the integrity of the very contract documents circulating that night. He produced a clause from a boilerplate vendor agreement, one Carson had never actually signed, and insisted that the language allowed the company to pursue damages for reputational harm. The number Derek wrote on a notepad and slid toward Carson was $1 million, framed not as a request but as an inevitability, the way a storm is inevitable once the clouds have already gathered overhead. Carson read the number twice, and something in his expression did not change, though the room around him seemed to lean forward, waiting for him to break. Carson answered in a voice too even for the temperature of the room, explaining that he had printed exactly what the order file specified, nothing more and nothing less. He offered to reprint every placard by morning at no charge, refund the full invoice, and send a written apology if that would settle the matter cleanly. It was a reasonable offer, the kind any professional makes when an honest mistake surfaces. But Vivienne did not want the matter settled. She wanted an example made in front of investors who needed to see her handle imperfection with a closed fist. She told the room loudly enough that a caterer nearby stopped pouring water mid-pour, that people like him needed to understand their place before they touched anything with her name on it. A few guests near the bar laughed under their breath, assuming the man in the plain jacket was simply a struggling vendor about to be taught an expensive lesson. Carson did not raise his voice or defend himself further. He simply lifted the misprinted invoice from the table, studied the wrong name printed across the top, and turned toward Marin, asking quietly whether she was certain this was not the exact name she had sent him. Marin's face lost its color instantly, her fingers tightening around the tablet she carried, because she knew precisely whose mistake this truly was. She had typed the name late the previous night during a scramble of last-minute changes, and in her exhaustion had dropped the final letters without noticing. She wanted to speak, wanted to admit the truth standing right there in front of everyone, but the fear of losing a job she desperately needed kept her silent, and she simply looked away as Carson accepted her silence for what it was. Vivienne did not let the silence linger, filling it instead with a performance meant for the investors watching from the edges of the room rather than for Carson himself. She spoke of standards, of legacy, of a family name that had survived 3 generations of automotive business without ever tolerating carelessness from the people who served it. Every sentence she delivered sounded rehearsed for an audience, polished the way a speech is polished when someone has learned that image matters more than accuracy in rooms full of money. Carson listened without flinching, understanding that nothing he said in that moment would change the outcome she had already decided upon before he ever walked through the door. A young waiter near the bar quietly lowered his tray, watching the scene the way people watch something they know they will describe to friends later. Even the string quartet in the corner faltered slightly, the cellist glancing up before catching himself and returning to the score in front of him. Nobody in that gleaming room, dressed in silk and tailored wool, seemed willing to step forward and suggest that perhaps the punishment did not fit the offense. 3 days later, Carson sat behind the counter of his own shop long after closing, the fluorescent lights humming above rows of paper stock and drying ink. His son was already asleep down the hall in the small apartment above the storefront, A life built carefully out of discipline and quiet routine since his wife's death had rearranged everything he once assumed permanent. Carson ran every number by hand at the end of each week, kept his supplier relationships honest, and treated every job, no matter how small, as though his family's stability depended on it, because it did. Before the accident of fate that placed him inside that glittering ballroom, Carson had spent nearly a decade in a very different career, working as a contract compliance reviewer for public transit agreements across 3 states. He had built entire audit frameworks used vendors to inflated costs or buried unethical treatment of smaller subcontractors deep inside dense paperwork nobody else bothered to read. When his wife became ill, he stepped away from that demanding world entirely, choosing the quiet predictability of a print shop over conference rooms and travel, wanting nothing more than mornings with his son. The transition had not been easy in the beginning, and there were nights during those first difficult years when Carson wondered whether he had made a mistake trading a respected career for the uncertainty of small business ownership. He learned bookkeeping by trial and error, taught himself the rhythms of supply orders and equipment repair, and slowly built relationships with local businesses who valued reliability over flash. His son grew up among the smell of fresh paper and the hum of machines, learning early that his father measured success not in titles but in promises kept. Neighbors down the block often remarked that Carson Hale was the kind of man you could hand your last $20 to, and trust completely that he would return exact change. That reputation, quiet and unglamorous as it was, meant more to him than any conference room title ever had. What almost nobody in his current life knew, not even his closest friends, was that Carson still held an active certification as an independent contract compliance reviewer, a credential that allowed him to serve on ethics evaluation panels for select public contracts when called upon. He rarely mentioned it, because that old identity belonged to a version of himself he had deliberately set down, and he had no interest in resurrecting a career that once cost him time he could never get back with his family. The certificate sat folded in a drawer beneath old tax documents, untouched for years. Late that same night, an email arrived in his inbox from the city of Ashford's Contract Oversight Office, a routine reminder that his final written evaluation was due for a transit vehicle agreement under final review. Carson nearly deleted it without reading closely, assuming it was another minor consulting request he would decline as he always did. But when his eyes reached the vendor name listed beneath the contract number, he sat back slowly in his chair, staring at 4 words that connected every thread of the past 3 days together. Kingsley Wolf Automotive Group. Vivian did not let the matter rest once the ballroom event ended, because for her, unresolved conflict felt like unfinished business demanding a conclusion. She instructed Derek to escalate immediately, and within 48 hours, a formal legal letter arrived at Carson's shop demanding payment of $1 million within 7 days, threatening a lawsuit for what the letter called deliberate falsification of commercial identification documents. The language was dense and aggressive, designed less to persuade a judge than to frighten a small business owner into compliance before he ever consulted an attorney of his own. Alongside the legal pressure, Vivian's communications team quietly circulated a narrative among industry contacts, suggesting that a careless small vendor had jeopardized executive identification protocols during a major million-dollar launch event. The story spread the way rumors spread among people who value proximity to power more than accuracy, reaching a regional bank that had extended Carson a small business line of credit years earlier. Within days, a loan officer called to ask uncomfortable questions about pending litigation, and one long-standing client quietly paused a recurring printing contract until things, as the client put it, settled down. For the first time since opening his shop, Carson watched real financial strain creep into his weekly numbers, the kind of strain that kept him awake doing math at his kitchen table after his son had gone to bed. Yet, even under that pressure, he refused to respond with panic or emotional outbursts, choosing instead to do what he had always done best during his years reviewing contracts, which was to build a record. He gathered the original order email from Marin, the time-stamped file showing when the name was typed, delivery confirmations, the misprinted invoice itself, and a copy of the lobby security footage from the night of the event. His son noticed the change in the house even without understanding the details, the way children often sense tension long before anyone explains its source. Carson made a quiet decision early on to shield the boy from the worst of it, keeping the legal letters folded inside a drawer rather than spread across the kitchen table, keeping his voice light during dinner even when his mind was elsewhere. He still packed lunches, still checked homework, still made time for the small rituals that gave his son's world its sense of steadiness. It cost him more energy than anyone watching from outside could have guessed, holding two entirely different postures at once, calm father in the evening and methodical investigator late into the night. A neighbor who ran the hardware store 2 doors down noticed the light in Carson's back office burning past midnight for nearly a week straight and asked once, gently, if everything was all right. Carson only said that some problems took patience to untangle properly and left it at that. While assembling his evidence, Carson noticed something small but significant buried inside the shared order platform Kingsley Wolf used for event vendors. The original file, the one Marin had sent containing the misspelled name, had been quietly edited after the event, altered to make it appear as though the correct spelling had been submitted from the very beginning. It was a clumsy attempt to erase the truth, the kind of move made by people who assumed nobody beneath their income bracket would ever bother checking the metadata closely enough to notice. The shop itself stayed open through all of it, because bills did not pause, simply because Carson's evenings had filled with legal letters and quiet investigation. He still opened at 7 each morning, still restocked the toner cartridges himself, still greeted regular customers by name as they came through the door for business cards or wedding invitations or church bulletins. His son sometimes sat at the back counter doing homework after school, unaware of the storm quietly gathering around his father's evenings, and Carson made sure it stayed that way for as long as he possibly could. There was a particular kind of discipline in living 2 lives at once, the ordinary daytime rhythm of a small business owner and the careful, methodical nighttime work of a man rebuilding a case fact by fact, and Carson carried both without letting either one slip. Carson had spent enough years reading contract documentation to know exactly where to look, and the file's revision history told a story its authors had never intended anyone to read. The edit had been made less than 2 days after the ballroom confrontation, time-stamped at nearly 11 at night, long after any normal business explanation could account for the change. He saved a copy of the revision log immediately, understanding from experience that digital records like this one had a tendency to disappear quietly once someone realized their mistake. It was the kind of small, careless error that powerful people rarely anticipated, because they were used to operating in a world where nobody ever checked the fine print behind their decisions. He called an old colleague from his years in compliance work, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Farrow, who still worked in municipal contract oversight, simply to confirm that his read of the revision data was sound. Patricia listened patiently over the phone, asked a handful of sharp technical questions, and confirmed that what he was describing would, if verified, constitute a serious breach of contract documentation integrity. She did not pry into why he was asking, respecting the quiet distance he had kept from that world for years, but she did remind him gently that once he re-entered this kind of process, there would be no comfortable way to step back out until it concluded. Carson pulled up the full contract file for the Ashford Transit Agreement. Reading through pages of technical specifications, vehicle safety data, and financial disclosures late into the night. The project involved supplying a fleet of electric transit vehicles, charging infrastructure, and long-term maintenance services for the entire city, a deal structured to run for years and worth a total of $88 million. To win final approval, any bidding company needed to satisfy 3 core requirements set by the Oversight Board, covering technical capability, financial transparency, and demonstrated ethical treatment of smaller vendors and subcontractors. That final requirement, buried on page 41 of the contract, existed because Ashford had been burned before by a previous transit vendor who systematically underpaid small subcontractors while presenting flawless numbers to the City Council. The Oversight Board had rewritten their standards afterward, explicitly stating that any bidder found using intimidation, manipulation, or false blame against small vendors during the evaluation period would be automatically disqualified from consideration. It was a clause most companies barely noticed, tucked between insurance requirements and warranty terms, written by people who had learned the hard way how power tends to behave when nobody is watching closely. Carson read the clause 3 times, feeling the weight of what he now understood settle across his shoulders. The $312 invoice was no longer a private grievance between himself and an angry executive. It had become direct evidence of exactly the kind of conduct the ethics clause existed to catch. If Vivienne had genuinely used legal threats to extract a false confession and demand $1 million over an error that originated inside her own company, that behavior sat squarely inside the disqualifying language written into her own bidding contract. He stared for a long time at the line near the bottom of the final evaluation form, the words printed in plain black type that read "Reviewer signature required," a phrase that suddenly carried more weight than any legal letter Derek Ashcroft could send. Carson understood, with a quiet clarity that felt almost strange after years away from that world, that his signature stood as the final gate between Kingsley Wolf Automotive Group and $88 million of public money. Outside his window, the street lamp flickered against the early hours of morning, and Carson sat back in his chair, letting the full weight of the coincidence settle over him slowly. He thought briefly about simply declining the evaluation altogether, stepping aside and letting another reviewer handle a contract that now felt personally complicated in ways procedure rarely anticipated. But stepping aside felt, to him, like its own kind of dishonesty, a convenient excuse to avoid a responsibility that had landed in his hands through no scheming of his own. He closed the laptop that night without responding to a single message from Vivienne's legal team, choosing instead to let the process unfold exactly as procedure required. Rather than react with anger, Carson filed a formal verification request through Ashford's oversight office, demanding that Kingsley Wolf produce the original vendor order file, the full internal email chain, a documented justification for the $1 million demand, and any evidence of actual financial damage resulting from the misprint. It was a measured, procedural move, the kind that rarely made headlines but tended to unravel exactly the sort of story built on intimidation rather than fact. He sent it not as a threat, but as a simple, professional request that any legitimate claim should have been able to satisfy easily. Vivienne read the request with something close to amusement, convinced that a small print shop owner filing paperwork posed no real threat to a company of her scale and reputation. She instructed Derek to respond with even greater force, and his follow-up letter, meant to intimidate, contained a phrase that would later prove costly, acknowledging that the misspelled name had originated from, in his own written words, materials provided by the Executive Operations Division. It was a small, careless admission buried in aggressive legal language, but it confirmed in writing exactly what Carson had already gathered through metadata and timestamps. 2 nights later, Carson's phone rang with an unfamiliar number, and on the other end was Maren Whitlock, her voice tight with nerves as she finally said what she had been unable to say in that crowded ballroom. She was not calling out of resentment toward her employer, but because watching an innocent man get crushed under a lie she had created weighed on her more each day. She confirmed plainly that she had typed the name incorrectly during a chaotic overnight scramble before the event, and that afterward she had been quietly instructed to say nothing about it to anyone. Maren explained, her words coming faster as the conversation went on, that a senior member of the communications team had pulled her aside the morning after the event and told her, in no uncertain terms, that admitting fault would only complicate matters for everyone involved. She had gone along with the instruction out of fear rather than loyalty, telling herself for days that silence was the safer choice for someone in her position. But the sight of Carson standing calmly at the center of that ballroom, absorbing blame that belonged to her, had stayed with her every night since, and she said she could no longer live comfortably with that image in her mind. Carson thanked her without judgment, telling her plainly that he understood how fear could silence even good people, and that what mattered now was simply the truth moving forward. He assured her that whatever came next, he had no intention of making her the villain of this story, since the real fault lay with those who had asked her to stay quiet in the first place. Before ending the call, Maren offered to provide a written statement if it would help, an offer Carson accepted carefully, knowing it might come at real professional risk to her. As Carson continued reviewing the broader contract file in his role as evaluator, he discovered additional inconsistencies buried inside Kingsley Wolf's vendor payment records. Several line items marked as fully resolved payments to smaller subcontractors were, according to bank transfer dates, cross-referenced against internal notes, still being deliberately withheld as leverage to negotiate steeper discounts. It was a pattern, not an isolated incident, a company culture built around squeezing the smallest players in every transaction until they either accepted less or walked away entirely. The pressure from Vivian's side did not ease despite the quiet gathering of evidence against her. Through Derek, she sent one final message intended to close the matter before the upcoming contract hearing, stating plainly that Carson should sign the prepared confession admitting fault, or he would lose everything he had built. She had no idea, sending that message, that the man she was threatening already held the single signature capable of ending her company's chance at the largest contract it had ever pursued. The morning of the final contract presentation arrived with a clear sky over downtown Ashford, and Vivian walked into the city council chamber with the confident stride of a woman who believed victory had already been decided in her favor. Reporters lined the back wall, investors filled reserved seating near the front, and city officials shuffled papers at a long curved table beneath the seal of Ashford mounted high on the wall behind them. She believed, with total conviction, that Kingsley Wolf Automotive Group stood only moments away from securing the $88 million transit contract that would define the next decade of her company's growth. Carson arrived quietly, seated among a small group of independent contract reviewers near the back of the chamber, dressed in the same understated jacket he wore to every ordinary day at his shop. Vivian spotted him from across the room and assumed, with the same certainty she brought to everything, that he had come either to beg for reconsideration or to finally accept defeat gracefully. She crossed the aisle briefly before the session began, leaning close enough that only he could hear, asking with a thin smile whether he had come to pay what he owed or to ask her for mercy. Carson said nothing in return, simply resting a thick folder of documents on his knee as the council chair called the session to order. when the panel reached the portion of the hearing dedicated to vendor ethics compliance. Vivienne rose confidently to the podium and assured the council that Kingsley Wolfe had always protected the interests of smaller partners and subcontractors throughout every project the company undertook. It was a smooth, well-rehearsed statement, the kind she had delivered countless times before rooms far larger than this one. At that exact moment, Graham Pemberton, the steady chairman of Ashford's Contract Oversight Board, asked for the independent evaluator assigned to the ethics portion of this contract to step forward and present his final findings. The room shifted, chairs creaking softly as heads turned, and Vivienne watched with slowly dawning confusion as the quiet man from the ballroom rose from his seat near the back and walked toward the podium she had just left. For the first time since that night 3 weeks earlier, the color drained slightly from her expression as recognition settled in. Carson stepped up to the podium and spoke without raising his voice, laying out the evidence in careful chronological order for the entire chamber to hear. He described the original order file listing the misspelled name, his offer to reprint everything at no cost, the formal demand for $1 million that followed, and the later discovery that the order file had been quietly altered after the event to hide where the mistake truly originated. He placed Derek's own written admission on the overhead screen, the words materials provided by the Executive Operations Division displayed plainly for every council member to read. Vivienne attempted to interrupt twice, insisting that this was nothing more than a personal grudge dressed up as professional testimony, her voice rising in a way that echoed uncomfortably against the high chamber ceiling. Carson waited calmly until she finished before continuing, explaining that had this remained a private matter between two people, he would have simply let it go and moved on with his life. The real issue, he said, was that her company had taken an internal mistake, transformed it into a manufactured financial penalty, and then used legal intimidation to force a small vendor into accepting blame that was never his to carry. He then turned to the second set of documents, the withheld vendor payments he had discovered while reviewing the broader contract file, and read the relevant figures aloud without embellishment. 3 separate subcontractors, none of them larger than his own shop, had been told their invoices were settled while records showed otherwise, funds held back as quiet leverage during discount negotiations. Carson explained that this was not a single lapse in judgment, but a pattern, one that suggested the treatment he received in the ballroom reflected how the company routinely handled anyone without the resources to push back. Several council members exchanged glances at this point, flipping through their own copies of the documentation with visibly growing concern. Graham asked whether Carson had given the company an opportunity to respond to these findings before the hearing, and Carson confirmed that his verification request, sent weeks earlier, had gone largely unanswered except for another threatening letter from Derek Ashcroft. Graham asked Carson directly for his professional conclusion as the assigned ethics evaluator on this contract. Carson answered in a steady, unhurried voice, stating that he could not certify a bidder who publicly built a brand around protecting small businesses while privately using legal pressure to threaten the very people that promise was supposed to protect. He declined to sign the final ethics certification required to complete the bid. The chamber fell into a heavy silence as the council briefly recessed to review the submitted documentation among themselves. Reporters in the back row leaned toward one another, whispering, already drafting the opening lines of stories that would run before the evening news. Investors who had spent the morning nodding along to Vivienne's confident presentation now sat with arms crossed, studying their phones, recalculating risk in real time the way money always does when confidence turns to doubt. Sutton Blair, seated near the front on behalf of the finance division, closed her eyes briefly, already anticipating the difficult calls she would need to make before the day ended. When the council returned 20 minutes later, Graham announced that Kingsley Wolf Automotive Group no longer met the ethical requirements outlined in the final evaluation stage of the bidding process. The $88 million transit contract, the centerpiece of years of planning and investment, was formally reassigned to the city's backup bidder before the session adjourned that afternoon. Vivienne remained seated for a long moment after the gavel sounded, staring at the empty podium where she had delivered her confident assurances only an hour earlier. The room emptied slowly around her, investors gathering coats and briefcases without meeting her eyes, the easy warmth of earlier handshakes replaced by careful distance. She had walked into that chamber certain of victory, certain that no small vendor could ever threaten something she had spent years constructing, and now she sat alone in a half-empty room absorbing the sound of her own name being quietly erased from the largest deal of her career. Vivienne caught up to Carson in the marble hallway outside the chamber as reporters began drafting headlines that would appear online within the hour. Gone was the commanding presence from the ballroom weeks earlier, no stage lighting now, no applauding investors, only fluorescent hallway light and the hollow echo of her own heels against stone floor. She offered, almost desperately, to withdraw the lawsuit entirely and pay Carson $200,000 if he would simply revise his written findings before the story spread any further. Carson declined without hesitation, telling her plainly that the thing needing correction was never a report. But the way she treated people the moment she believed they held no power over her. For a brief moment, something flickered across Vivienne's expression that looked almost like genuine confusion, as though the idea that money could not simply resolve every consequence was foreign to her entirely. She asked, quieter this time, what exactly he wanted from her, if not payment, and Carson answered that he had never wanted anything from her at all, only for her to stop taking from people who had nothing left to give. Derek attempted to step between them, reaching for another legal argument, but Graham Pemberton had already heard enough from the sidelines of that hallway to act. The council formally requested a full disclosure from Kingsley Wolf regarding withheld vendor payments and documented intimidation practices, a request that sent a visible ripple of concern through the remaining investors still lingering near the chamber doors. Vivienne watched Carson turn and walk toward the elevator without another word. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, nobody around her rushed to smooth over what had just happened. Within days, several major investors quietly began withdrawing financial commitments from Kingsley Wolf Automotive Group, unwilling to attach their names to a public ethics investigation. Financial news outlets picked up the story of the lost transit contract, framing it not as an isolated setback, but as a warning sign about how the company treated the smaller partners it depended on to function. Board members who had previously deferred to Vivienne on nearly every decision began scheduling private meetings without her, a shift she noticed immediately and understood exactly what it meant. Sutton Blair, the company's chief financial officer, advised Vivienne bluntly that a public apology and full restitution represented the only realistic path toward saving what remained of the company's reputation. Sutton had spent months quietly worried about exactly this kind of exposure, having flagged the withheld vendor payments internally more than once, only to be told the matter was under control. Now, with the numbers laid bare in a public hearing, she finally had the leverage to insist on changes she had wanted to make for a long time. Reluctantly, and for the first time in her career, Vivienne accepted advice she would once have dismissed outright without a second thought. She signed a formal letter withdrawing every demand for the $1 million payment, acknowledging in writing that the original naming error had originated entirely within her own company's operations team. Alongside the retraction, She authorized full payment to every small vendor whose funds had been quietly withheld across recent contracts, including immediate compensation to Carson for the damage done to his business and reputation over the previous month. Derek drafted the language carefully, aware that every sentence would eventually be read by lawyers on the other side, by journalists, and by a board of directors already losing patience with the company's handling of the entire affair. The compensation offered to Carson totaled $45,000, covering the lost client work, the strain on his credit line, and the cost of the legal consultation he had briefly required during the ordeal. It was, notably, far less than the $1 million once demanded of him, and Carson accepted only the amount that reflected actual documented damage, declining any additional sum offered simply to make the matter disappear quietly. The letter, once made public, closed the loudest chapter of the story, though its consequences would follow Vivienne for a long time afterward, discussed in business schools and industry panels as an example of how quickly reputation could unravel once trust was broken with the smallest, most easily overlooked partners in any enterprise. Carson returned to his small shop the following week, and life resumed its familiar, unglamorous rhythm of early mornings and quiet afternoons spent among paper stock and ink cartridges. He did not become wealthy overnight, did not purchase anything extravagant, and made no public statements celebrating what had happened inside that council chamber. Yet word traveled steadily through the local business community. The story passed quietly from one small business owner to another, about a man once threatened with a $1 million penalty, who ended up costing a powerful executive an $88 million contract, using nothing but patience and the truth. New customers, many of them small business owners themselves, began finding their way to Hale Ledger and print over the following months, drawn less by advertising than by the quiet respect the story had earned him throughout the region. Some came simply to shake his hand and thank him for standing firm on behalf of people who rarely had the means to stand firm themselves. Carson accepted the gratitude with the same modesty he brought to everything else, always redirecting conversation back to the work at hand rather than the events that had briefly made him something of a local figure. Vivienne, meanwhile, was ultimately removed from direct operational control of Kingsley Wolf Automotive Group by her own board of directors, who cited the damage done to investor confidence and public trust. She stepped back from public life for a long stretch afterward, and when she eventually resurfaced in industry circles, colleagues noticed a marked change in how she handled disagreements with smaller partners, though few ever asked her directly what had prompted the shift. The company itself continued operating under new leadership, though it now carried strict new internal policies prohibiting any form of pressure or intimidation directed at smaller vendors during public contract bidding, policies that employees quietly credited to the very incident that had once threatened to sink the company entirely. Maren Whitlock kept her position at the company, and in time was promoted into a role overseeing vendor relations, a job she approached with a level of care shaped directly by what she had witnessed that night in the ballroom. She reached out to Carson occasionally afterward, not out of obligation, but out of something closer to genuine respect, and he always answered kindly, holding no lasting resentment toward a woman who had ultimately found the courage to tell the truth when it mattered most. On a quiet afternoon several weeks later, Carson climbed a short ladder outside his shop to rehang the old wooden sign that had faded slightly under years of sun. A longtime customer stopped on the sidewalk below, watching him work, and asked whether he had ever felt afraid going up against a family as powerful and wealthy as the Kingsley Wolfs. Carson paused, looked down from the ladder with the same steady calm he had carried through every difficult moment of the previous month, and answered simply that he had not taken $88 million from anyone. He had only refused to lie so that someone else could keep it. If quiet honesty has ever outlasted someone else's loudest cruelty in your own life, remember that patience like Carson's is never wasted, only waiting.